books, and his various news sites. He is well known for his influential essays and interviews at the New York Times philosophy column, The Stone, and at the prominent nonprofit progressive news organization, Truth Out. Yancey's two newest books are Until Our Lungs Give Out, Conversations on Race, Justice, and the Future, which is a collection of critical interviews with prominent intellectual figures such as Cornel West, Judith Butler, Noam Chomsky, and others. He's also the co-editor of the book In Sheep's Clothing, oh no, this is a tough word,
Idolatry.
idolatry of white Christian nationalism. And lastly, Yancey is also the editor of Lexington's book series on philosophy of race. I am so excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. And thank you for that nice introduction.
Yeah, of course. It's been a new, anyone who's been listening, it's been my new challenge. I'm trying to get through at least one without making a single mistake. It has not happened in the last, I think, maybe 7 episodes. I'm getting close though.
That's fine.
Idolatry, what does that word mean?
Oh, idolatry is, particularly in this context, is sort of the worship of idols, right? And
Got
within the
it.
context of that book, it's the worship of whiteness. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. So I'm actually really excited to kind of get into this conversation. You've done so much work in this space, and I wanted to start. I think with a lot of the terminology, especially when we speak to professors and philosophers, it's really important to make sure when we use certain terms that we're talking about the same thing. So I always like to start when we use the word race itself. What exactly to you does that mean?
Sure. I think historically, if you think about the European tradition, where race sort of comes out of the very concept to fix people, the thinker Francois Bernier wrote this important text in 1684, and his way of thinking about race is that there are uh, groups of individuals that have certain specific characteristics, and these characteristics are shared and they are passed down through a line of descent. And that's sort of how we think about race in our contemporary moment. I often refer to it as race naturalism, which is the claim that there are certain genetic, biological, phenotypic features that individual groups that are considered discrete in terms of those characteristics have. But also, there are other characterological features like industry, intelligence, the capacity to learn, criminality, uh, um, predisposition towards stealing, lying, et cetera, ones that are inferior. These characteristics go along with that. And traditionally, when we think about white supremacy, the deployment of race is precisely used in that way, that there are these fixed characteristics so that Black people on this score become genetically inferior as a race, and white people are deemed genetically superior, or that their superiority is predicated on something like certain kinds of genes. If you think about it, there's a good way of also thinking about this in terms of the Swedish thinker Carl von Linnaeus. For those who may not have heard of him, he's deemed the father of taxonomy, and taxonomy has to do with classifications. And while he didn't use the term race, he set the very foundation for scientific racism because he made a distinction between four kinds of humans or four varieties of humans. And I'll
Mm,
just give you two. Well, I'll give you four, and then I'll explain two of them. One, there were what he called Americanus, Native Americans, Europaeus, which were whites, Asiaticus, which is a broadly construed term that meant Asians or red people, and or sorry, yellow people in this case, but would be conclusive. The Americanus would be red people, but the Asiaticus would be inclusive of brown people, yellow people, and then there's Africanus, which are black people. And what's interesting about that distinction is that he not only just describes them as being real, he also predicates of them different kinds of features, so that he argues that the Europeans who are white have a predisposition toward happiness, and they're also governed by law. whereas Afrikaners or black people have a predisposition of laziness, and they're governed by what he
Mm,
called caprice, which means they're capricious or they're unpredictable. So
mm,
one can see how Carl von Linnaeus's work was sort of lay the foundation for kind of racist epistemology or theory of knowledge, in as much as the ideas that Black people, by their very nature, are lazy and unpredictable, whereas white people, by their very nature, are happy and governed by law or reason or logic. So when I use the term race, um, at the moment, there are theorists who talk about, the position of race being socially constructed, which means that race is not a real thing in the world, but it's something that we've socially constructed, just as we socially construct the institution of marriage, or just as we socially construct, let's say, money. Race is seen to be socially constructed. So, is there this thing called race? Is it in the world? Uh, the
mm,
theorists that I work with, that I read, the ways in which I think about race, I don't see it as a real feature of the universe or of the world. It's socially
mm,
constructed. But nonetheless, it's this idea that there are these fixed and discrete individuals that belong to these discrete groups.
mm. I would be so interested to read some of the works of original travelers and adventurers who, first left their homeland and were to actually interact with people who looked different than them. Like, what were their tellings of how other people existed? I mean, I think,
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean,
What we find is that it was primarily Europeans who traveled outward. And what we find is that if you think about anthropology, which is the study of the anthropos or the human, that was preceded by natural history. And natural history studied the fauna and flora, the animals and the plants of a particular kind of region. And what these early anatomists, zoologists, anthropologists did who were coming out of Europe, they would expand outward and use a certain kind of hegemonic dominant frame for examining bodies that didn't look like themselves. So it
mm,
wasn't just descriptive in an objective way, it was also normative in predicating of these bodies inferiority or being savage or being ersatz, but not being European, not being white. So in that traveling, that traveling is a kind of colonial process where the encounter with these individuals are not encounters of curiosity, uh, but
mm.
and even if it were curious, if they were curious, that curiosity turns into a kind of amazement at the level that leads to sort of violation of those individuals as human
Wow.
beings.
You know what's so interesting? So I actually spent 7 months finally recently traveling through India. And one of the things that I had noticed is kind of this feeling of what you're talking about right now. When I would see a bunch of the other people around me traveling, there was kind of this perception of, oh, let me learn from. You're right. There's this distinction between the curiosity of the naive curiosity where you're just like, let me simply learn from these other people versus let me have a certain viewpoint or lens of the world that I hold, and let me now judge what these people are doing from my lens, right? There is a difference. So my question is, and something I'm really interested, I think it's only been as of late that I've been paying more attention to how history has shaped what we experience today. I feel like as I'm getting older, I'm realizing as being part of history now, I realize I'm like, okay, I can trace back certain events to coming to where it is today. And so now I'm realizing how important history is. And the centrality of history, like where like who kind of dictates the narration of history is a very fascinating and important thing. And it
Absolutely.
starts, it seems, even from what you're talking about here, where it's like when one group is the one doing the adventuring and the traveling and the learning about the world, it seems that often the narration will be centered through that lens itself. So, do you feel like a lot of these conceptions of race have started from that point itself? If it was, for example, people from a different country who are doing more of the exploring and traveling and going to other places, would conceptions of race been centered around them?
Excellent. That's a really important question. Um, the last question that you posed is what we call, philosophers would call, a counterfactual question, meaning it's counter to fact. So we don't have instances where non-European countries explored the world. So we're not talking about the Portuguese and the
Spanish.
Spanish, right, who went outward. In this case, right, you don't have people of color, right, non-Europeans who are engaging these kinds of voyages for the purpose of colonization, for the purpose of going out and in search of what some have called El Dorado or the land of wealth or spices, right? And
Hmm.
I like this distinction that you made because there is a difference. I think curiosity, if it's driven by a sense of respect for the other, if it's a kind of curiosity that says, um, you're different than I am. Let me learn something from you, right? Let me understand who you are so that I might be changed through that experience. It's the idea of alterity and respecting the otherness of others. Rather, what we've got in the meta narrative European um, drive is the idea that these individuals are exotic, that they are different
Hmm.
as inferior, different as in savage. They don't have anything to teach us. If anything, they teach us what we've always known, that we are the center of the universe, right? So
Hmm.
I would think curiosity and wonder are profound dispositions that can lead to radical forms of self transformation. But when they are eclipsed by a form of knowledge that attempts to um, totalize what it is that one is understanding, then you eclipse the other. So, your counterfactual question, it's not clear what would have happened. One would think that, one would hope that non Europeans who encountered those who are European would have recognized those differences as differences without superimposing on those differences values that degraded them or that saw them as less than. But the only history we have, pretty much, unless there are some historians out there that can tell us about those non-European initial encounters. But the only story that we have, I think, is the story that talks about European domination, colonial desire, which is driven by the the desire to of usurpation, to take over, to colonize, to have those who are not like oneself reflect the sameness of oneself, which means,
Hmm.
again, you don't accept them on their own terms. It's what philosopher Lewis Gordon calls a kind of ontological closure. Ontology in philosophy is the study of being. It comes from the word ontos, and ontology is the study of being. And so it means that when you meet the other, when you greet the other, it's not really a greeting at all. It's a superimposition that involves an ontological closure where their very being is closed off as anything
Hmm.
other than savage, criminal, inferior, etc.
So I want to touch back on that particular point, and I think that's really interesting. So this is what I'm hearing you say, and I want to make sure I'm getting the right. Well, we're on the same page. So pretty much, when an individual interacts with another, it's not so much that you're actually understanding and meeting that person; it's that you're placing whatever it is that you feel about the world and all of your understandings onto that individual. Is that kind of what you were saying?
Absolutely. And when we live within structures of domination, patriarchy, sexism, ableism, racism, you name it, those who are privileged by those systems are impacted by those systems and carry those systems with them. And it's through our gestures, it's through our modes of embodiment. And it's since I've written a lot about the white gaze, GAZE, it is through our ways of visualizing the world, right? So that if you're filled with a lot of machismo and patriarchy and misogyny, you look at a woman and all you do is you sort of reduce her to her genitalia, or you reduce her to her body. You make her less than she is.
Hmm.
When you think about whiteness, the site of racism, the black body or the body of color then becomes a criminal body. It becomes the inferior body. It becomes the site of disgust. It becomes the abject body, which I consider to be the throwaway body, the ungrievable body, as philosopher Judith Butler would say. So, yes, I think that um, the notion of the encounter is so very important because when that encounter is mediated by, constructed by forms of hegemonic ways of looking and interacting, already the, as it were, sacredness of the encounter, the beauty of the encounter, the fluidity of the
Mm,
encounter is already cut off and precluded from happening, already foreclosed. So, underneath that, of course, is my idea that a more flourishing encounter would be that one encounters the other with a sense of wonder that is
mm,
a capacity not to know in advance who this individual is and to be impacted by their difference.
wow. Academically, I haven't gotten to kind of think about these things through text, but I feel like a lot of my lived experiences have gotten me to this place where, I mean, I think what you're saying is really profound in that to be able to interact with someone in that manner, you have to be somebody who has a relatively open mind slash positive view on people. I have found that people who are very afraid of other or fearful, it's difficult for them to be like, let me experience this person for who they are. And it's safer for them to be like, okay, they're a stranger. I don't know who they are. Let me just, put a bunch of stereotypes on them. Therefore, I will try to maximize my safety. So I have a really
Absolutely.
interesting, I have a question for you. And it's, this conversation is making me think about it. It's that there seems to be this, it seems that safety is something that all humans value highly. And everyone tries to figure out a way to live and a mental model of people and predictions so that they can optimize their safety. And so they can identify when somebody isn't safe to be around and who is, and what environments are dangerous versus those who aren't. And it seems that we could have separated society, for example, by height, where we were like, everyone who's 5'8" and over have to live in this area, everyone who's 5'4" to 5'8" have to live here. But we didn't do that. And we chose to focus on a few other social. It seems that what people are aimed towards is figuring out a mental model of the world that optimizes for their safety. And one thing that people could have done, for example, would have been, okay, let's divide society by height. Everyone who's 5'8" and over have to live in this area. Everyone who's 5'8" and under have to live here. They could have divided it by a large number of things. Those who have facial hair versus those who don't. But for some reason, it happened to be race. Why do you think race was selected over one of these other differences?
Excellent question. I would answer in this way. Um, Part of it has to do with, I think, the dominant ocular metaphor in Western culture. And by the dominant ocular metaphor, I mean the idea that access to knowledge is through what we see. And what you'll find in early Greek civilization, in Western culture, is the emphasis of the ocular over, let's say, taste or touching or hearing. So that then knowledge becomes, notice we say things like, uh, he has clear vision. He can see it objectively. Speculation, right? All of those terms refer to kind of gazing. And so I think that with that dominant metaphor, and also with the dominance of the use of what might be called the Manichaean divide in Western culture, and by that I mean the distinction between white and black, or darkness and light. So you get Christianity um, uh, perpetuating and propagating that Manichaean divide, and you get Zoroastrianism also being a part of that. And what you have then is you get a synthesis then of the ocular metaphor, the stress on seeing as access to knowledge and judgment and measurement. And then you get the background of the Manichaean divide, blackness and lightness, where lightness means intelligence, it means virtue, it means goodness. Darkness means evil, it means backward, it means primitive. It's the very embodiment
Mm,
of the devil. right? So when you have that kind of ocular metaphor operating that has epistemological significance in terms of accessing knowledge, and you've got the moral categories of black and white operating, it's clear then that what one will encounter when one encounters the dark body, right? One encounters the dark body, you already have a kind of epistemological linguistic framework for labeling so that the dark body, and this happens, by the way, in the Crusades, it was clear that the Christian project was not just to eliminate the Muslims, it was to eliminate the dark people. Right? It was to eliminate those who are backward, those who are against Christianity, which means those who are against the light, the light. So, and when you think about light, think of enlightenment, right? These are very important tropes. And when we're thinking about race, so I think that the way in which you tell the narrative of why phenotype versus height, or why phenotype versus, oh, I don't
Mm,
know, the capacity to run fast. In other words, one would think it's
mm,
it's any arbitrary attribute or any arbitrary capacity. Why that? And I think that if one is to tell a story about how this happened, part of telling that story, it wouldn't be necessary to give an account of the ocular, the saliency of the ocular in Western culture and the saliency of looking at surfaces, measuring them, and thereby the importance of phenotype, what is seen on the surface, right? And then the moral color apparatus that has to do with predicating of those dark bodies something like a form of difference that is actually an inferior difference rather
mm.
than just a difference that is different from mine but without a hierarchical structure.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that part is so there's so much depth to that. The question of is it possible to have differences without labeling them in a particular hierarchy? I have found this to be my kind of my biggest difference I've noticed when I talk about Indian culture to those who are culturally sensitive and understanding versus those who aren't is when I have to preface anything I say well with it's different, but it's not necessarily worse or better. It has its own pros and cons. And I guess that's my question. How is it possible to have differences without having to label them as is this better or worse?
Yeah. I think that um, there are some who might actually argue. I'm not going to argue for this position, but just for those who are listening, there's some who might argue that within the context of making a distinction, there's a kind of normative assumption going on. In other words, to say X is different from Y, to make that difference suggest a kind of normative assumption that's built into making difference or to judging something to be different. But my sense is that um, as long as we have these structures of domination, um, oh, is that me? I'm sorry. We're gonna have
No, it's
to,
okay.
yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Phone call.
It's my mom. It's her birthday. It's her birthday yesterday. Okay,
Oh,
let's go on. So,
yeah.
so my sense though is that given that there are these hegemonic structures, from ableism to racism, I think trying to make that distinction, where we make distinctions where there are differences, but differences that are not don't have implications for inferiority, superiority, aesthetic differences. One is ugly, one is disgusting, one is beautiful. We have a lot of work before we can actually reach a moment in our contemporary world to see, as it were, beyond those frames, as Joe
Hmm.
Fagan says, the very incredible sociologist, beyond the framing. He calls it the white racial frame. But it's not the only frame that's operating, though it is a central frame. I think the question that's being asked is how do we recognize difference without that difference undergirding a certain kind of violent distinction of difference
Hmm.
as hierarchy, right? And it's not clear to me until we are able to deconstruct and really get rid of these frameworks that are intrinsic to the process of distorting difference into a difference that's hierarchical. I think it's going to be absolutely next to impossible to do that, right?
Yes.
Because there are also unconscious ways in which this operates. We're not always consciously doing it, right? But part of it is the ways in which, speaking of education, the ways in which we have been educated to adopt these assumptions of difference that just aren't differences of equality, but differences of inequality, right? So
Mm.
we're really talking about going back to the word ontology. It seems to me that we would have to, as Judith Butler says, we'd have to create an insurrection at the level of ontology itself. In other words, we have to create an insurrection at how we understand the world in terms of its being. And at the moment, we are trapped. We are tethered to frameworks that are hierarchical and that are in and therefore are violent in this way, that don't respect differences, that are differences that speak to our unity or our sameness or something that we have in common. In other words, what we
Mm.
want is a way of appreciating difference that allows for sameness and that yet allows for difference.
Mm. Well
But we don't
said.
have that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something I've been thinking about recently, which is for a long time, and this is like a particular narrative, which is just saying that, we're all the same, like we're all equal, which is one half of that is true and the other half isn't, which I have found that while everyone is equal, we're not all the same, and there are very large differences and very large similarities, but there culturally, for example, small things such as eating with your hands versus eating with a spoon or a fork and praying in certain, I mean, those aren't very large differences, but they are considerable differences. And I have found that where sometimes people have a hard time bridging their own understanding of race or cultures is understanding that just because two things are different doesn't necessarily have to mean that one is better than the other. And so i
Absolutely.
guess I guess so my main question would be, I had this question I wanted to ask you. I need to now like sit back and think because it was had to do with differences. Yes. So when it comes to differences, let's say we find differences by gender. From a philosophical perspective, how do we know that those differences are caused genetically due to those differences, or whether it's just due socially or culturally, or how do you actually distinguish those two? Is that possible?
Sure. Good question. I would say that I mean there's a lot of literature that have been written by scholars in queer theory, feminist theory, who are taking on this question. Obviously, it's a long-standing issue regarding gender and involving the question of nurture versus nature. I think when we talk about gender, for the most part, the current I think discourse on this issue is that gender is a certain kind of performance, as Judith Butler would say. And by performance, we mean that gender is precisely that reiteration, that mode of repetition that is not a repetition because there is something, call it an essential form of gender that's expressing itself. Rather, the way in which we express ourselves precisely constitute the kind of persons we are. That's a little complicated way of putting it, but nonetheless, the point that I'm making here is that when we talk about gender, I think we need to think about that in terms of a social construct, in terms of the ways in which institutions recognize us or refuse to recognize us, the ways in which other individuals or groups refuse or in fact recognize us, the way in which one's gender identity is a part of a dominant discourse or not part of a dominant discourse. So I think that's very important. And I think that what you're asking again is it's a long-standing question. And my view is that um, we we need to be careful that we don't give a biologistic reductive reading of any form of identity for that matter. Otherwise,
Hmm.
then we come back to the notion of being fixed. And a
Hmm.
biologistic analysis when it comes to gender, sexual orientation, race are part and parcel of hegemonic systems that then point to those alleged essences and
Yes.
say, this is why we oppress you, because you have the genetic predisposition to be oppressed.
Mm.
I mean, take for an example the term hysteria. If you look up the etymology, which has to do with the origin of words, hysteria comes from the word womb. It comes from womb, which means that women, on this view, are predisposed to become hysterical because
Mm.
they have a uterus or uteri, right? But this is ridiculous, of course, right? Because it justifies. It says that women are mad or they're given to outrageous reactions because of some biological feature that they have, rather than the notion that women are historical being a presupposition that males, men, that we superimpose on them so that we can gain a level of control. So I'm suspicious of really the reductive efforts in biology
Mm.
to define certainly gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, you name it, where the idea is that there is some biological substratum that determines who we are in terms of those categories. So I'm much more of a historical, cultural, socially
Mm.
constructed theorist when it comes to those identities.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, I think there's been so many times in history, which I guess is the part that I'm most fascinated by. I guess, the big question that this season I'm trying to uncover is, what does a world and an education past where we look at race in this particular way look like? I mean, what does that world look like? And the reason I'm interested in that is I find division and unity to exist in every part of the world by given some line. I mean, it really doesn't matter. It could be a sports team, it could be a religious team, it could be gender. I mean, it could be your sexuality. I mean, it seems to just exist. And so my question is as we erase one line of division, is it simply always just replaced by another? Or is it possible to remove lines of division and have them just not exist?
Yeah, interesting. Look, I think let me make a connection with um, the idea of education. Education, if you think about it, it comes from the Latin educare, and that means to lead out. And I like the figurative sense of leading out. I just don't like the way in which it's often described as leading out of darkness and leading into the light. Again, because of the
Yeah.
semiotic, racialized implications of that, right? But the leading out is interestingly figurative in as much as it suggests that there's a movement, some kind of movement away from a pre-existing state of affairs, right? I use, think about the German Bildung, that term, which means cultivation, or the term paideia that philosopher Cornel West is very fond of using, that means a certain kind of critical self-interrogation. I think that if we think about education in this way, as a kind of radical form of rethinking, of refeeling, of a different mode of being in the world, going back to Judith Butler, an insurrection at the level of ontology itself, I think that we can begin to trace the historical roots of the ways in which certain kinds of divisions were superimposed by us, namely by human beings. But of course, not all of us in this sense, right? Certain groups have had historical power inordinately in ways in which others have not, right? So I think that part of the significant part of this issue is when we think about race, for an example, we are currently not in a post-racial moment or post-race moment, despite what some have said, or particularly during the election of Barack Obama, right? That somehow we've made it or we've arrived. We haven't arrived. We still live in a white supremacist culture that was always already that which underwrote the very foundation of this country, including, of course, genocide vis-a-vis the indigenous. So my sense is that until we're very serious about certain kinds of divisions, those kinds of divisions that are predicated on violence, that are predicated on destruction, that are predicated on genocide, that are predicated on oppression and keeping a particular group down and keeping a particular group outside of the human. I think until we radically rethink what it means to be human, right, we'll
Mm.
continue with these particular kinds of divisions that are violent, divisions that are that again race uh, uh, our very humanity, or make a clear distinction between those who are grievable and not grievable, those who ought to be respected and those who are not deserving of respect. So I think that
Mm.
when we're talking about those differences, plurality is fecund, meaning it creates a sense of flourishing and a sense of self-actualization. It's when it's when our conceptions of safety are grounded in a sense of invulnerability that the problem arises, right? Because you're right,
Mm.
we all want to be safe, and it is necessary that we're safe because we're all vulnerable, which means etymologically we're all are exposed to being wounded or hurt. So the notion of a kind of basic sense of safety is very important. But what happens when the concept of safety is rethought in terms of self mastery or self dominance, or rather of dominance, where there
Mm.
is a line that is built around one's safety such that others are excluded based on various kinds of assumptions. So, for example, if you take neighborhood covenants or redlining, where white people would get together and say, we're not having any black people in our neighborhood because, after all, they're inferior. They would get together and create these divisions. Now, one might say that's a sense of safety, but it's predicated on a fiction that black bodies, that black people will come in and destroy them, or that black people are criminals by nature. So the insularity, the idea of closing themselves off, and with that concept of safety, it's not about keeping themselves truly safe. It's about keeping themselves safe in relationship to a phantom or fiction that they themselves have created. But they want to keep themselves safe partly because they want to preserve their own sense of white sanctity, their own sense of white purity, which again is a
Mm.
fiction, right? So I'm
Mm.
suggesting that what we need to do is rethink the ways in which we've latched on to an idea of safety that's really not about keeping ourselves and others safe. It's about keeping ourselves safe as a group on the assumption that there are others that need to be kept out. Hence, if you think about immigration, the idea is to keep those out. Why? Because they're, as you know, Trump has said, they're rapists or they're criminals, right? This is a classic case of xenophobia, where one is afraid of the stranger, uh, the xenos, which is the stranger. And hence, you'd have to rethink the whole concept of what we mean by loving kindness, or the Hebrew word hesed, what it means to encounter the stranger, which goes back to this
Mm.
distinction between difference. To encounter the stranger is to be expose oneself to alterity and difference, but it's an exposure that um, is structured by the recognition of a fellow human being, not the pre-stereotypification of this person as less than human or as the
Mm.
person who's going to kill me or take away my
Yes.
safety.
Wow. What I'm hearing you say is rethinking our very own conception of what our relationship is to any stranger, or to who another is, which I strongly don't think is an intellectual journey, but I think it's more of a spiritual journey, in the sense that there's no science that's going to show you that, hey, you can trust a stranger, that will make you believe that. There's no stat or number that will do that for you. It has to be something that's deeply embodied and lived in. And so
Absolutely. Yeah.
and so it seems that, I mean, even as I interact with politicians and I try to understand their motivations for why they go into policy, or whatever. I mean, one thing that I'm learning now as I'm getting older and interacting with a lot of adults is there seems to be this underlying desire for power that's driven by greed that exists everywhere in the world. And I think what ends up happening is oftentimes that desire is not really like there's no guardrails against what you should or shouldn't do as long as you get the outcome that you want, and you'll figure out whatever justification you need to be like, you know what, I actually did the right thing. And so in alliance with kind of figuring out what your relationship is to the stranger, there also seems to be this part which is understanding perhaps this endless desire for more and more power and prestige and ability to influence others is also inherently in itself going to lead to some of the divisions and problems that we have now, because you always have the people who feel like they are worthy of the power, and you'll feel the people, and in doing that they'll feel that I am more worthy of this power than anybody else, right? I mean,
Mm.
even if you ask any politician that question, why did you run for mayor or why did you run for governor, the belief is I have better ideas or I can do this job better than others. And there is in that essence kind of this distinction between you and others. It could be intellectually, it could be, it could be because of some other reason, but there is this kind of division that gets formed simply from the drive to be more powerful. So,
Sure.
what is it possible to move past some of these divisions if that is an underlying, it seems, human desire?
Yeah, sure. Good point. One question becomes whether or not, um, as Homo sapiens, let's say, we are in fact intrinsically the kinds of individuals who want more and more and more at the expense of others, right? It reminds me of Thomas Hobbes, who referred to human beings in the state of nature as Homo homini lupus, which means man is a wolf to man, right? So this is idea that we're out to get each other, right? To exploit each other for these very deeply narcissistic, selfish reasons. But bracketing the assumption that this is how we are by nature, because it's not clear that we are. Um, but what is clear to me, it's a good point that you made. Um, what is clear to me is that we are, again, controlled often by a certain kind of framing. And this framing, one might say, is the framing of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the idea that you and I are atomic. We're these discrete individuals who have certain kinds of desires, but these desires are mediated and structured by market logics. And the idea of market logics then is to get more and more and more, is to increase your own value and to see the fruits of your own self-interest, right? So I think that what would be interesting is to think about the emergence of neoliberalism or the emergence of even beyond that framings of totalitarianism or frames of regimes that aim to control, to set absolute limits, and then to think about the ways in which we haven't critically examined a different kind of framing, where we haven't placed more emphasis not on a market economy, not on a market logics, but non-market values, right? Why have we failed to recognize the stranger other than as exploitable, other than cheap labor, or other than the self against which, as Toni Morrison say, I understand myself as having, white. She says that in her book Playing in the Dark, that the American white understands themselves as historical through the juxtaposition of themselves against those who are history-less, right? Or they see themselves as aesthetically beautiful in relationship to those who are aesthetically disgusting. So I think that in that, in the language of the stranger and the language of neoliberalism and the language of exploitation have to be critically examined, such that we can begin to deconstruct those distinctions in such a way that, and I think you're right, not to be mystical, but to use the word spiritual in the sense that it's just not about what we can manipulate. It's not simply about the capture and possession of land, right? It's not just about colonial gazing or who we can control. It's not just about a sort of capitalistic orientation. It's about rethinking a fundamental kind of humanism where the other is embraced in their full alterity, that their otherness, as Levinas, the philosopher Levinas might say, their otherness bears upon us as a responsibility, right? So we have to
Hmm.
rethink what it even means to be responsible to the other. At the moment, we're not gripped by that. We don't feel enough outrage about what it means to be responsible and to take responsibility for not only what's happening in the US, but what is my responsibility? What is your responsibility to what's going on in Ukraine? What is our responsibility for the thousands and thousands upon Palestinian children that are killed or Jewish children that were killed? And I think the way in which we do that is we begin to think critically about the idea that we are atoms, that we're somehow discrete. Rather, we're always touching each other. And I use the term in my own work, haptic, Haptic, and haptic means to touch, that we're already part of a historical, social skin that extends
Hmm.
across the world, so that what I do in my own individual life touches someone hundreds of miles away,
Yeah.
thousands of miles away, right? So I think we need to rethink what it means to be part of a global system in which my own individual
Hmm.
actions are constituting for others sites of violence, right? We may not think we're tied in this way, but COVID-19 taught us this, that we're tied together. We're closer. We're this close and tied by this social skin, right? And we need to rethink that as a fundamental way, as a fundamental ontology of thinking about the ways in which we're tied together. In that way, then, the idea of the stranger is already our neighbor.
Hmm.
And what is one's relationship to one's neighbor, right? It means, if you look up the etymology, it means to dwell near, to dwell near. And dwelling near needn't just be spatial, it can also be temporal. It can also be, I may not be in I may not be in Gaza, but what I do has implications for Gaza or for Israel
Hmm.
or for the Ukraine, right? And so in that sense, they are my neighbor. We close, as it were, the space by recognizing a shared humanity.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well said. Yeah. I mean, you know, again, intellectually, I feel like I didn't get to this point, but it was when I had this moment when I was teaching in the Himalayas, and I was staying with this woman, and she was truly one of the most warm, caring, loving people I've ever met. And it was at that moment I was thinking, I was like, we have grown up in completely, different parts of the world with such different experiences and worldviews. But yet this connection is something that's going to last with me for the rest of my life. And anybody I interact with from here on out, I will carry a part of what you have vested in me. And in that way as well, you just have no idea, how a single thing that you do can just reverberate throughout the entire world for years to come. And I think the spiritual part of that is understanding that while that seems that every action you're doing is so important, that's also true for every other person, for every other ant, for every other, it really runs quite deep. And so it's like, that's why I think one of the hardest things to kind of understand about being a person is understanding how unique and amazing and important you are, while at the same time understanding that everyone and every animal and every rock is also, serving a huge role in some sense. So both are true.
Absolutely.
You are uniquely important, and at the same time so is everyone, which is hard. But you know one
Absolutely. That's right.
one thing I wanted to kind of, I feel like I've been running an education book club, and we just finished Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks. And one thing that she talked about a lot in that book that I've been trying to embody myself now is understanding how often academia and these intellectual conversations can be very out of our own bodies. It can be super focused on the mind. Let's act as if we're just two minds floating and talking about these abstract concepts. But what it's made me realize is that the bodies that we inhabit also play a huge role in our experiences. And so while we've been able to talk about race and division in an abstract sense, I'm really curious to now start understanding my guest's personal lived experience, understanding what is it meant and what has it been like living as a Black man for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. I just want to say one thing about what you were saying previously. And I think that, again, this counter ontology that we have in the form of neoliberalism will also metastasize and help us to understand the idea is that it's not about mastery, right? Mastery suggests that there's something to be mastered, which is which implicates the idea of control. And when we think about the earth, the way in which you talked about other animals, et cetera, the earth too is an other. It needs to be appreciated, right? Not to be exploited. It has to have a certain kind of integrity that speaks to us. But as long as we
Mm,
wrap ourselves in the garment of masters, which is a flawed ontology to begin with, a flawed way of being to begin with,
mm,
we can't even hear nature speak to us, just as we can't hear the stranger speak to us, right? So that's very important. And I think that this is a nice segue to hearing others and what it means to attempt to explain one's own identity as racially uh, embodied differently. I think that for me, and I think the fact that you're reading Bell Hooks is absolutely incredible. As you may know, I was really good friends with Bell Hooks,
oh wow.
really good friends, meaning friends to the point that she and I would once sat down and had popcorn together, right? So that's friends with Bell Hooks, and so she will be missed, greatly. And I think that what she's saying is very important because in philosophy, in particular, in academia more generally, uh, we're seen as thinking beings, where the mind is separate from the body. It's all about abstraction, right? It's all about thinking. And I think what Bell Hooks does so beautifully is to give us a concept of education that places us squarely in our bodies, which is to say, recognizes our fundamental embodiment.
Mm,
Because not only is it's not about abstraction, sure, it's about a level of abstraction in terms of conceptual analysis, which is fine, but it's when we valorize or make abstraction the end, the only end of
mm,
education that becomes the problem, right? Because then we can't talk about what it means to be and feel in the world, what it means to undergo a certain kind of affect, what it means to experience joy in a classroom, what it means to experience alienation in a classroom, what it means to feel outrage in a classroom. So
mm,
what I do, just as again another segue to what it means to be black as embodied, let's say in the U.S., tell my students we begin with a wonderful thing that I have them do. I have them look at each other, so really look at each other, not look at me, because often they're looking at me structurally, right? So I want them to look at each other. And then after I have them look at each other, I ask them to turn back to me and I remind them, I say, we can guarantee that 100 years from now, that no one in this classroom will be alive, that you will all be dead, right? And then I quote Cornell West, who says that we will become the culinary delight of terrestrial worms, right? But
mm,
what I want to say to them is, whatever their beliefs about the afterlife, I have no idea what their beliefs are. I have my own hopes about that. But from what we can tell, this might be the only time that we appear ever in the history of this universe, right?
mm,
As embodied beings. And I want them then to take the seriousness of their finitude, the fact that at any moment they could die, and have that structure how they think about the process of learning. What does it mean to
mm,
have passion? Passion means to suffer, right? So embodiment for me is the point of embarkation when I'm doing my own pedagogy, my own critical education, as for bell hooks as well. But also it's important to me in terms of how we think about race. And I'll just give you an example. If you think about Audre Lorde, the feminist Audre Lorde, she talks about an instance where she was on a train with her mother, and there was a white woman sitting next to her. And she was very young, she was a child. And she could see that the white woman was looking at her in a strange way, looking down at her. And she couldn't figure it out. She wondered, what could this be? Why is this woman looking at me as if I am despicable, as if I am, something that is of no value? And Audre Lorde says, as a little girl, she thought maybe there was a bug on herself that the woman was looking at, right? Maybe an insect of some sort. So she looked around and checked, no insect. And then it's at this point that Audre Lorde says that even, you see, as a child, as a young Black child, she knew that she inhabited the wrong body. That is to say, the wrong body is defined by whiteness. She was a young Black girl. So it wasn't a bug that the white woman was looking at, it was her body. It was Audre Lorde's young body that was the site of disgust, right? And this is very powerful. So the question becomes, what does it mean to be a young Black girl, in the case of Audre Lorde, to have been deemed despicable, to have been deemed something that you look at and you don't want to touch, to be untouchable? How's that? To be the American, to be the African American untouchable, right? And so it is through embodiment that we undergo experiences of anti-Black racism, of trauma. So that for me, my mother, when we were living, I didn't come from wealth. We were living in the projects through most of my teenage year, in fact, all of my teenage years. And my mother bought me a telescope. And all this is to say what it means to be Black, a Black male racialized in the US. And remember, it's relational, right? I had my telescope. I was taking it outside to look at, I don't know, the moon, stars, what have you. And as I was bringing it down the stairwell, a white police officer looked into the door because there were these little glass bits, these square glass bits that you could see through from the outside. And he pulled open the door and he said to me, which I'll never forget, he said, "Man, I almost blew you away. Almost blew you away." And what he meant by that is that he almost shot me to death because he thought that my telescope was a weapon. So the question is for us in an anti-Black society like the US, what does it mean to have a Black body and to have a telescope? What does it mean to have a Black body or to be embodied as Black and to have your cell phone out that becomes phantasmatically transformed into a gun, right? So for me, what that communicated to me is that the Black body then is the site of the white gaze, which distorts its integrity, which distorts its authenticity, that distorts what it means for me to be Black, how I define my Black body, right? I knew I wasn't a criminal. This was the telescope, for crying out loud. Right? It was about expansion, right? Looking out into space. It was a young Black boy living in the projects, looking to space. And yet that white police officer's gaze truncated me. It fixed me in a way that was not aspirational, right? So to be Black embodied in the US is to occupy the site of, as Afro-pessimists would say, a la Frank Wilderson, it's to occupy the space of the always already about to be killed, which means we are exposed to gratuitous violence. We are exposed to generalized dishonor, and we're exposed to what is called natal alienation, which means at any moment I can be taken away from my mother as a Black male. And of course, it's not just exclusive to being a Black male, but that's my experience as a Black male. So what I'm saying to you is that being Black, being embodied as Black, informs us at the level of our own sense of tragedy in a white world. It tells us how the white world sees us, right? But we not only feel the pain and angst and trauma from the white gaze and how we're treated. Think about George Floyd, right? Over 9 minutes, neck, on someone, a white police officer's knee on his neck. Think about Trayvon Martin being pursued, being chased with someone who has a weapon because he is in a neighborhood where he should not be, quote unquote. The point here is that not only do we feel the trauma, but we also have insight, which is what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about when he talked about the gift of second sight. We not only see ourselves through double consciousness, through the eyes of others, and we not only internalize that to see ourselves in some sense as inferior and no good, but this racialization of the Black body also creates a level of knowledge where we understand whiteness and these structures of power better than those who are in fact in positions of power. Right? So what I'm saying is that in the US, which is predicated on, let's call it, um, a kind of skin, a kind of skin ideology, uh, an epidermis, going back to the idea of the gaze and going back to the Manichaean divide, blackness always already signifies danger. Blackness signifies don't touch. It signifies um, rapist. It signifies thief. It signifies uh, um, gangbanger, right? It signifies wretchedness. It signifies all of those negative things that the white imaginary can project upon it, right? So to be Black in America is to wake up in the morning and anticipate the possibility of being killed by a trigger happy police officer who mistakes your phone, your cell phone, as a weapon, right? And that's not a space of flourishing. To live one's public life as always already on the precipice of being killed, right? So when I think about my own embodiment, I go back to the telescope and I think about what that meant early on, that Black bodies aren't supposed to own telescopes, right? Because we're not intelligent enough. And if we do have a telescope, it can't be a telescope. It must be a weapon. It must be a rifle, right?
Mm. That first, I want to say thank you for sharing. I think sometimes it can be really hard and vulnerable to kind of to not abstract everything, right? I mean, to just be like, hey, this is what it's felt like for me, and I think that benefit of the doubt that comes sometimes from when people, I mean, a police officer, I mean, I've had this happen recently where I was driving and I had my, a police officer had pulled me over and made it a whole big deal because my phone was kind of, I was, it was on the stand, but I had like pulled it off to like look at the directions. And she pulled me over and made it a whole deal just to run my plates and everything. And I wasn't doing anything wrong at all. And it's been like that actually quite for some time. But I had never you normalize it. You normalize that feeling of like I'm probably doing something wrong or I should be afraid because I've done something wrong in my life somewhere. But when I was in India, even though in some ways it's unsafe. I have the privilege of being a male. I have a privilege of, few things where I felt really safe being there in the sense that I looked like everyone else. And so I never had the fear of like, I'm doing something wrong by being here. And it was only when I flew back after so long that the second I landed in San Jose or SFO, I immediately felt like, oh, I need to now, and that's the only time where I felt how different that feeling of, oh, I don't have the benefit of the doubt here felt. And then
Mm-hmm.
now I've been here for 3 months and I've normalized that feeling. Now that I'm talking about it, I don't even feel it anymore because now my body has just internalized that feeling. It's no longer something I'm recognizing or noticing. And so
Absolutely.
it's truly, I think, and I think over a lifetime, that feeling can really erode at the soul, that when you feel trusted and safe, I mean, the skies are the limit. And so, yeah,
You know what? That's interesting. You should put it that way. We carry the traces of whether it's anti-black Asian Indian racism or anti-black US racism, right? We carry the traces on our bodies and we carry the traces of the trauma in our bodies, right? And I like this notion of normalization because you mean by that, you don't mean that it's right. You just mean at some point we come to expect that indeed this is what's going to happen, right? Whereas white people have the freedom to think otherwise. I mean, Tim Wise, who's a very fascinating scholar who's done some really important work in terms of bringing attention to the problems with whiteness, he says that he was driving in his car with his music blaring and his windows were tinted. And a police officer pulled him over, told him to pull down his windows. And when he saw that he was white, the police officer said, "Oh." He said, "Oh," right, which was sort of "oh" means it means you're white, you're safe. Let me let you go, right? But when I'm driving in the car, I'm often feeling like please don't let the car in the back of me that I can't see at night be a police officer, right? That's because we carry the trauma. And it's not unjustifiable. It's first of all, it's experiential trauma, but it's justifiable fear. That's precisely what's going to happen. So it's not this kind of irrational paranoia. It is fear based on the historical reality of whiteness in the US. When white people are followed or when they're pulled over by police, they have the privilege of debating whether or not they turned properly, they signaled properly, maybe their taillights out, etc. I've never heard a white person say, "Oh my God, I've been pulled over because I'm white," and go through the trauma of that. In fact, recently, not too long ago, rather, here in Georgia, a white police officer, stopped a white woman, and she was panicking. For those who are listening can look this up. She was panicking, and he attempted to calm her down. And the words that he used were, "Don't you know we only kill Black people? Don't you know we only kill Black people? Don't you know we only shoot them?" So, and this is real, right? It's amazing. It's unthinkable, but yet when you understand the racial anti-Black logics and the xenophobic logics of white America, it becomes all the more clear. Now, of course, he didn't get fired. He was retiring, but I assume he would have gotten fired, or let's hope he would have gotten fired. But the idea is that the only thing he could have come up with is a narrative that stereotyped Black people, and to make the white woman feel safe about her own whiteness, you see. He communicated to her something like, "Don't worry, when you're white, you don't get shot. You don't get killed by police officers." So in a way, he was telling a truth that was, again, based on racism, right, itself. But I got you. And of course, in India, I imagine if one is Dalit, right, I assume that one is in one's body quite differently, right, in
Yeah,
terms of how one is treated, even in India, right? We got those
definitely.
distinctions, right?
Yeah.
I think that um, I appreciate your picking up on the story that I told and my willingness to be vulnerable, because I think pedagogically, going back to bell hooks and going back to embodiment, because we are embodied, we're always already vulnerable and open to be wounded. And I encourage that in my classrooms, so that for me, when my students leave my classroom laughing or smiling, I feel like I failed. When they leave my classroom in silence, and you could just hear a pin drop, right? Or perhaps you can't even hear that. Who knows, right? But nonetheless, the point is, when they leave carrying the weight and the gravitas of what we've talked about, I know that I've been successful. And vulnerability is what I exhibit when I'm talking about white racism to my students, because I've always taught in predominantly white institutions. I talk about my own sexism, right, which is very vulnerable. So I tell them, look, if I'm going to own my sexism, you're going to have to do the work also, particularly of white students, of owning your racism, right? And it's often surprising when they hear me say, "Well, I'm a sexist," right? Because professors don't say that, you know, you can't do that. Well, that's because I believe that we ought to speak what is called parrhesia, Parrhesie, and parrhesia is the Greek word that means fearless or courageous speech. It means to say it all, right? And it seems to me you have to, if you're in this role as professor, to question, one, your own sensibilities, your own sense of your own certainty, to show how you're also implicated in structures of power. Because if you want your students to be honest and to be vulnerable, how can you want that and desire for that to happen if you're not yourself being vulnerable before them, rather than existing as some abstract mind outside of your body, right? To be sexist is to have a body. It's not an abstract concept, right? It means to be in this world in the midst of structures that denigrate and are violent toward women, right? And I want to say how I'm complicit with that very process, right? And it's used as a bridge to um, to get them to meet me halfway, to show that we're all vulnerable in some sense, and that true education, the notion of educare, means to radically transform one's mode of being, one's mode of feeling, one's mode of understanding the world. It's to be truly educated means that one will do all that one can so that the world as it currently exists in its status quo, with all of its violence, with all of its angst, with all of its ennui, is to transform that world. That is the commitment. So it's not just about the degree, it's not just about the great school that one goes to, right? It's about how do I become, as John Dewey would put it, part of a critical citizenry that critiques constantly the demos, that critiques constantly this fragile experiment called democracy, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you that's a beautiful definition of education. And I think one that, yeah, if I had gone into undergrad, I went to grad school with that definition of education, but when I went to undergrad, that was not the definition. And I feel like the longer that definition sticks with you, the more useful your education will be, regardless of
Absolutely.
whether it's public school, whatever environment that you're in. When your brain understands how much you can develop your soul, if you want. Not that I necessarily believe that we have one, but it's. I think that's what I think when education becomes really powerful. But
Sure.
I want to say I had such a pleasure having this conversation today, and I would love to have you on again in a week or 2 weeks or whenever your calendar opens up to record a part two, because I think there's so much more to break down and speak about. And I think this was a lovely kind of foundation that we've built of some of these big topics. And now I think to add on to that, to bring in that education piece, I think would be amazing.
Absolutely. Sure. It's been a pleasure, man.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.